It started like any other day, until a routine traffic stop turned into a nightmare. A woman just going about her business found herself face to face with an officer whose power seemed to go to his head. What began as a simple interaction quickly escalated into something far more troubling. His harsh words, condescending tone, and unfair demands left her feeling small and powerless. She thought she was alone in this fight, trapped by someone who was supposed to protect her. But just when the situation seemed hopeless, someone unexpected stepped in, a witness who couldn't stay silent any longer. What happened next would change everything, not just for her, but for the officer too. This is a real-life story of courage, justice, and a moment that exposed the abuse of authority. Stay tuned, because what comes next will leave you speechless. The woman, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, tried to keep calm as the officer barked orders at her. She had always believed in respecting authority, but something about this situation felt wrong. His tone, his body language, the way he seemed to enjoy her discomfort. She explained herself politely, hoping to de-escalate, but the officer wouldn't listen. Instead, his demands became more aggressive, and his accusations more unreasonable. A small crowd began to gather nearby, drawn by the commotion. Among them was a man who had been quietly observing the scene. He noticed the woman's distress, the officer's behavior, and the growing tension in the air. Something about it stirred a deep sense of responsibility in him. He couldn't just stand by and watch this unfold. As he stepped closer, the officer's demeanor shifted slightly, sensing the presence of another force, one he hadn't anticipated. The man stepped forward cautiously, but with purpose, his eyes fixed on the officer. He could feel the tension in the air as bystanders whispered among themselves, unsure of whether to intervene or stay back. The woman glanced at him, her eyes pleading for help yet wary of what might happen next. She didn't know who he was, but his presence was enough to make her feel slightly less alone. The officer, however, wasn't pleased. He turned to face the man, his tone sharp and defensive. "Step back. This is none of your concern," he barked. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly asked, "Is everything all right here?" His question, though simple, carried weight. It was clear he wasn't just asking, he was challenging. For a moment, the officer hesitated, as if weighing his next move. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, turning the situation even more tense. The officer squared his shoulders, his authority now feeling challenged in front of the growing crowd. He directed his glare at the man, who stood his ground without a hint of aggression, just quiet determination. The woman, still seated in her car, could feel her heart racing as the situation grew more heated. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but fear held her back. What if standing up only made things worse? "You need to leave before you interfere in something you don't understand," the officer snapped, his voice sharp with warning. But the man didn't budge. Instead, he calmly replied, "I think everyone here understands enough." His words seemed to echo in the silence that followed as the crowd leaned in, their curiosity and unease growing. The officer's face turned red with anger, his authority slipping through his fingers. He took a step closer to the man, his voice low and threatening. "You're making a mistake," he said. The man, unfazed, locked eyes with him and said, "No, I think the mistake is yours." In that moment, the tension reached its breaking point. The officer's hand twitched toward his belt, and the crowd gasped. The woman's grip on the steering wheel tightened, her mind racing. She could feel the situation spiraling, and no one knew what was going to happen next. Just as the officer's hand moved toward his belt, a voice from the back of the crowd broke the silence. "I saw everything," the person called out, stepping forward. Heads turned as a young woman emerged, her phone raised, screen still recording. Her voice was steady, but her face showed the same mix of fear and determination the man had displayed moments earlier. "You've been out of line from the start," she added, her words slicing through the tension like a blade. The officer froze for a moment, his eyes darting to the phone in her hand. The crowd murmured louder now, their whispers turning into a low rumble of outrage. The man glanced at the new witness, his expression shifting to one of quiet relief. The woman in the car could hardly believe it. Someone else was standing up, and the officer's once unchallenged authority was now crumbling before him. But the officer wasn't done yet. His face hardened, and he pointed at the young woman. "Turn that off," he demanded, his voice cracking under the pressure. She shook her head firmly. "I'm not doing anything wrong. The truth needs to come out." The officer's composure faltered, and for the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain. Just then, another voice chimed in from the side. "She's right. We're all watching." It was an older man this time, stepping forward to join the others. The officer's head whipped around, realizing he was no longer in control. The power dynamic had shifted, but no one knew how he would respond or how far he was willing to go to regain control. The air felt electric with tension as everyone braced for what would happen next. The officer's gaze darted between the growing crowd and the young woman's phone, his frustration and desperation evident. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out, but then the sound of approaching sirens broke through the tense silence. The crowd shifted as another police vehicle pulled up, its lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, their faces serious as they surveyed the situation. The man who had first stepped forward approached them calmly. "This officer has been acting aggressively and unprofessionally," he explained. The young woman held up her phone, her video still recording. "I have proof of everything," she added. The new officers exchanged a glance before turning to the original officer. "We'll take it from here," one of them said firmly. The officer's face flushed as he tried to argue, but the crowd's collective gaze, the recording, and the backup officers left him no room to maneuver. Reluctantly, he stepped aside, his authority stripped away. The woman in the car exhaled deeply, finally feeling safe as one of the new officers approached her to ensure she was okay. As the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of relief and justice filled the air. The young woman stopped recording, and the man who had first intervened gave her a nod of appreciation. But just as the tension seemed to dissipate, one of the new officers turned to the original one and said, "We've been meaning to talk to you about some recent complaints." The officer's expression froze, and a ripple of surprise passed through the remaining onlookers. It turned out that this wasn't the first time his actions had come under scrutiny. The video and witnesses would ensure this time there would be consequences. As the woman drove away, finally free from the ordeal, she realized that the courage of a few strangers had made all the difference. And for the officer, his worst nightmare was only beginning. Continue from where the climax left off and write 150 words wrapping up the story. This part should provide a satisfying resolution, answer any remaining questions, and conclude subplots. Leave the audience with key takeaways or reflections, making the ending memorable and engaging. Naturally, include keywords to keep the SEO optimization strong. End the story now in natural way, also do not make any headings. Only write story in paragraphs. Also keep the wording simple and natural tone. Also make the script human-centric, and don't give feel of AI generated. Also don't create violated content which can affect YouTube policy.